Test 1 2 test 1 2 testing 1 and 2 testing 1.
Okay, welcome back. We're drinking deep, we're taking fast gulps, but boy, it's good material, helpful things. Welcome back online. We hope you enjoyed the workshops. Just as a brief reminder, following the third session, there will be opportunity for a question and answer with all four speakers. So we're going to bring them up and you'll get to ask questions. You're going to text your questions to me at the number on the screen. Let me just say this is my cell phone number. Don't be selling it to anyone. Don't be signing me up to crazy group chats. Okay, I'm trusting you. But we've found that if you text the questions, that just helps us to kind of keep things moving. Speaking of keeping things moving, Greg, we are going to invite you back for this third session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for hanging in there. It's a lot to pack in, but it's good stuff. And thank you again for the time you're investing. I do want to go back to just a couple of things. I think Joe has some slides that are, oh, there it is, okay. So, wonderful book by Bill and William Cries, father and son duo, on wrestling with Job. And Will is an Old Testament scholar, really brilliant guy, and his father's pastor. And so just a nice back and forth of some scholarly and pastoral stuff in the book, Wrestling with Job. And they talk about in there what we can learn from Job's friends. And I think, being attentive to the various stages of grief, being sensitive, being patient, being humble, being curious, being present, mourn with those who mourn, and don't presume that we know what God is up to. But again, be curious to even learn ourselves what God might be up to in our relationship with this person, in us, as we relate to their suffering as well. Being practical. So we've talked about how suffering is not a theoretical problem. The problem with pain, as we're going to talk about this evening, can be a philosophical, logical problem. Zack mentioned earlier Epicurus's syllogism, which will come up again. But everyone's suffering is very unique to them. It's very personal. And again, the need for improv in terms of applying what we know of Scripture and what we know of God in new situations, and the need to ask questions in the ways that we appropriate these resources. But also, suffering is a very practical problem. And so I want to just say that diaconal service is a very important way to express care. You don't have to say anything with words, but just to care for bodies and care for people in the mundane activities while they are disoriented and not caring for themselves very well. Again, though, as we talked earlier, the importance of asking permission rather than assuming things, as we saw in the quote from Atkinson. And then be in prayer in terms of it's the way that we connect, as we saw with lament, our experience of a deeply troubled context. We connect it to God, and we do so with loud groanings, with questions, with complaints, but we also do so in the context of a history of relating to God and the ways that God has been faithful to his people, to his world, and to us in our own story. So I thought these were very helpful, just summaries in terms of wise friends are curious, offer practical support, and intercede. I think one of the things that the book of Job is about is it's an indictment on a community that is not wise in the way that the friends relate to Job in the midst of his suffering, and gives us, I think, some things that we can take about our communities that we serve in and how we can be communities that absorb suffering. And that's what is called for, is to come alongside, as we're going to see this time. The thing that Job needs and wants desperately is an advocate, a mediator, someone who will come alongside. Not someone or a group of people who will re-educate him. Job does not need re-education. And that's, I think, one of the things in our tradition. The Reformed tradition prizes knowledge, which is a good thing to prize. But sometimes it's our default switch. And we think it's like, not every task requires a hammer. And so the right tool, the right response in this context is not re-education, but it's practical support, it's presence, it's silence, it's advocacy, it's intercession. In terms of the holistic problem of pain and how we relate, I think that empathetic presence, mourning with those who mourn, is a good way to talk about the heart and the connection with the one who's suffering. Diaconal practice is a good way to talk about the hands in terms of how we're responding with our actions. And then, as Zack illustrated so beautifully, in the way Jesus would tell stories, invite people in to reconsider a perspective, a lens on what they're experiencing, not by telling them what it means, but by inviting them into the story, into a bigger story, and to consider a bigger story. And so parabolic proclamation, I think, is a way to talk about that in terms of the way we respond holistically as communities of care to those who are suffering. And then I want to just make this final comment. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his wonderful book, Life Together. Also, another wonderful book I would mention to you is called Spiritual Care. Both of those books, I think, are very, very helpful, very wise. He talks about the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love to God begins with listening to His Word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. It is God's love for us that He not only gives us His Word, but lends us His ear. And so it is His work we do. So as preachers and as counselors, I know my way of feeling better about myself in a situation that I don't know what to do in. It's just a talk. I mean, that's the default switch, right? And Bonhoeffer rightly warns us against that we must listen first. And one of the things to notice about the cycles, what I would call not 3 group sessions, but 3 rounds of boxing between Job's friends and Job, is notice this. They have a lot to say about God to him, but they never talk to God about him. That's a very important reality in the book of Job. They talk to Job about God, but they never talk to God about Job. And I think that's a pretty strong indictment on that context in one way in which they're very unwise. And then Bonhoeffer, again, spiritual care is diaconia. It's a path of familial assistance. Proclamation doesn't jump over preliminary stages. The first thing we might need to do is just go to the grocery store for somebody, right? All right. That leads us into this last main group session about how wonder illuminates and bounds wisdom. And we've talked about how, Job and his friends, they're in open conflict. Initially, Eliphaz the elder had only sort of inferred that Job might consider his ways in the light of conventional wisdom. and the stereotypes that he wants him to consider as he's in the process of re-educating. And though Job initially hopes for the devotion of his friends, perhaps even their prayerful intercession, by the time that the first round is over, any expectations of connection are frayed. They are not connecting. They're talking at each other. They're not even really talking to each other. And so in chapter 13, we see Job asks his friends to be quiet. Verse 13, keep silent. Let me speak. Stop shushing me, basically, right? Stop shushing me. And then we see also in chapter 16, I've heard many things. Miserable comforters are you all. With your long-winded speeches, won't they ever end? Again, he's saying, be quiet. What ails you that you keep going on, arguing? Would you speak like this if you were in my place? Very penetrating question, right? Very penetrating question. What Job really needs is he needs a mediator. He needs a representative. He needs someone who can counter the accuser and be a defense attorney. Someone who can come alongside him instead of accusing him, to defend him, to advocate for him. And not necessarily to advocate for things you don't know, but to at least be curious about them, to at least question. What is the true understanding of what's happening here? Let's learn that together. And again, we do that by coming alongside. So there's this mounting. We've already seen Job move from wishing that he'd never been born into sort of this paralysis of grief to the anger that motivates his case against God in lament and his questions, right? And the book of Job is presenting that to us as a wise move. In fact, that's what God will say at the end of the story. He will say that Job has spoken of me rightly, but you have not. Now, that doesn't mean that everything Job said is correct, but it means he was on the right track. He was talking to God about his suffering. And that was key. So notice what we see in terms of this ongoing request for mediation. We saw it in chapter 9, beginning with verse 32. He talks about wanting to present his case. I need someone to arbitrate between us, verse 33. Someone who will help get me out from under God's rod of punishment so that his terrors will not frighten me. And then I will speak up without fear. But notice chapter 13, back to chapter 13. There's this emphasis and this mounting case in verse 15. Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Do you get the echo from chapter 1? Remember what the accuser said? He will curse you to your face. So notice there's a theme that's running through. And now this theme is going to gain fuel. Because what Job wants to do is he wants to have an audience with God, and he wants someone to stand with him when he does. That's what intercession is all about, isn't it? Brothers and sisters? An audience with God where someone is standing with us. I want to go back to Bonhoeffer. He's so helpful. A Christian fellowship lives by the intercession of its members for one another, or it collapses. I can't condemn or hate a brother for whom I pray, no matter how much trouble he causes me. Intercessory prayer is the purifying bath into which the individual and the fellowship must enter every day. The struggle we may undergo with our brother or sister in intercession may be a hard one, but that struggle has the promise that it will gain the goal. Gain the goal of being in the presence of God. Intercession means no more than to bring our brother and sister into the presence of God. And that's what Job longs for. He wants to state his case to God because he's convinced. Why? Why does he want to do that when he has so much trouble with God? He's convinced of God's integrity. He's convinced of God's character. He doesn't understand why these terrors have been allowed, but he believes now, not in the beginning. It's a process of illumination. It's a process of deepening wisdom, isn't it? Of the emotions being reshaped by the shouting and by the praying. You know what's fascinating about the 3 different cycles or 3 different rounds of prayer is that the spiraling speeches of the friends grind to a halt. They go nowhere. They're standing in place. They're running in place. They have nothing to show for it. Elihu will say as much. But Job has not stayed in place. Job has moved. He's moved in his thinking. He's moved in his emotions. He hasn't moved much physically. But what a world of difference between chapter 3 and chapter 19, as we will see. He wants to come into God's presence because he's convinced that if God can just hear him, that he will find comfort, he will find relief. And so in chapter 13, we also see in verse 22, "Summon me, and I will answer. Let me speak, and you then reply." This growing desire for being with God. And then in chapter 16, verses 19 to 21, "My witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend. And my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as a man pleads for his friend." This is desperately what he wants. He wants someone to go before the council and counter the accuser. Someone who will be his defense attorney, be his witness, be his intercessor. And then in this famous passage in chapter 19, we see in verses 25 and following. Let's start with verse 23, because notice Job is weary. Job is losing ground physically. And he thinks that he may not survive this in terms of how bad his skin disease is and how bad his body is and the torment of that. So notice what he says in verse 23 of chapter 19. "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, engraved in rock forever." I mean, that does 2 things. On the one hand, it reinforces what he said to the friends, that he's not going to be quiet about this. And on the other hand, it indicates that he's losing ground physically. And that what he is going to do is deposit a written record with God, so that maybe after his death, this can be adjudicated properly. So despite the despair, despite the pain, the physical pain and the emotional pain, there's hope. There's a belief that God is a righteous judge and that written testimony submitted after his death would be dealt with properly. And then notice what he says in verse 25. "I know that my kinsman redeemer, Goel, lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. What is this kinsman redeemer? We know this from the story of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, don't we? An advocate, one who stands in the gap, one who restores, one who repairs, restores the widow to her family's land and makes it possible to go on living and to enjoy life. This kinsman redeemer that deals with death in life-giving ways, connected to the promises of God, connected to the law of God. There's a lot of textual issues in this passage, as I'm sure Vicki could help us straighten out. But since we have such little time, let me just say this. There's an ambiguity here, an uncomfortable ambiguity. This sense, I may not make it physically, and yet this hope that God is a righteous judge and that death is not the end of God's justice, of God's goodness, of God's wisdom. That he is beyond our limitations, our limited traditions, our limited abilities, our limited capacities. He superintends it, and he can be trusted. There's hope here. 3 times in verses 26 and 27, I will see God. I myself will see him. I and not another. This deep longing, this deep desire for an audience with the righteous judge, and the hope that motivates it, the integrity of God. Now, we don't know. There's an ambiguity I mentioned. Is this God, this kinsman redeemer, or is this some third party? That's one of the questions. That's one of the challenges of this passage. And I don't think we have to resolve it completely. But here's what we already know. God has already defended Job in the heavenly council. He has already vouched for Job's integrity. That much we know. But maybe what he is praying for, maybe what he is longing for, now that he is sure that his friends will be no help, they will not be an intercessor, they will not be an advocate, maybe what he hopes for is that someone will stand up for him in the heavenly council. An angel, a messenger, one of the sons of God will come and dispute on his behalf. And so in some ways, this is setting the ground for something else that's coming. Now, I want us to see something, a pause in the action, a change of voice. No longer do we have Job's voice, no longer do we have any of the friends, but instead we have a poem that sits right in the hinge of the book of Job, chapter 28, a poem about wisdom, a poem that has many, many questions. Here it is. It's a poetic pause. And the way it functions, in many ways, is to look backwards, to evaluate what's happened so far. Let's evaluate the 3 rounds with the friends. And the resounding verdict of the poet is no, they didn't find wisdom. They searched for it, but they didn't find it. But then this poem also anticipates what will come after. Where does wisdom come from? Where is its place? Who knows the way? And of course, the verdict, which we mentioned earlier, is that only God understands the way to it. Verse 23. He alone knows where it dwells. He views the ends of the earth. He sees everything's under the heavens. And notice verses 25, 26, and 27 that anticipate the storm that is coming. When he established the force of the wind, and he measured out the waters, and when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, he looked at wisdom and he appraised it, and he confirmed it, and he tested it. And he said, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To shun evil is understanding. So you see, this hinge in the middle is an evaluative perspective of a narrator or the author looking back and evaluating what has come before, all the human efforts, all these 3 rounds, trying to find wisdom to understand how to properly interpret what's going on with Job, and it's come to a screeching halt. But then there's this anticipation. Someone does know the way. And unexpectedly, it's beyond human effort. All the imagery of chapter 28 is the imagery of ancient mining techniques, how you basically plunge in the dark and try to find the jewels. You drill these deep holes and try to find the metal, the precious metal, right? How do you find the way? But all the efforts are in vain. Someone knows the way, and it's in the path of the storm, in the wonder of God, in the majesty of God, in things beyond our manageability, beyond our planning. Of course, this is uncomfortable. This is not what Job's friends want to hear. This is not the way of conventional wisdom, because the way of conventional wisdom is all about planning. How can I prevent this? What can I do to prevent this from happening to me? I lived in D.C. in the early aughts, and I don't know if you remember this, but there was a sniper. And this sniper, there was no rationale. It was all random. And he was killing people, just shooting them from a distance. And one of the fatalities happened at the Home Depot where I used to go to shop. There's an absurdity to evil. There's a randomness to evil that defies explanation often. Sometimes we can explain it in some ways. But in many ways, evil is absurd. It's a manifestation that something is really wrong. Something has gone wrong. I wanted to figure out, what I could do. There was nothing I could do to protect myself or my family. That was the thing that was so frightening about the situation, right? And that's the fear that's motivating Job's friends. They're desperate for a plan to keep this from happening. But there is an unmanageability, there is an absurdity to it. But it is not beyond God's superintending, magnificent power. One of the things that we see after this poem at the end of chapter 30 and 31, we've already mentioned it earlier, is Job's defense, his final defense. And we talked about what he did with his wealth, how he passed the test of the extreme of wealth, and how he advocated for the poor and how he advocated for the vulnerable. But he asked the question in that context, do you not see my ways and count my every step? If I've walked in falsehood or my foot has hurried after deceit, let God weigh me in the honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. Now, not many of us dare to pray that way, and probably rightly so. Job's not talking about being sinless. He's talking about being faithful to the covenant. He's talking about using the provisions of the covenant to sacrifice, to have a substitute, to restore his relationship, and to keep short accounts with God and to stay in good stead with God. He has followed the way of wisdom. But the way of wisdom goes beyond conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom of retribution is never given up. It's important. Job's counting on it. He's counting on the fact that God is just, right? And so we're not rejecting conventional wisdom. What we're saying about conventional wisdom is this: it's not enough. It's not enough. There are limits. And so we lean into the extremes in the book of Job. I want to point out this final plot motivator in chapter 31. Again, you remember, Job wants a mediator. He wants an advocate. Notice what he says at the end of 31 in verse 35. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. Like a prince I would approach. So this is, some have described this as a summons of God. But that's not correct. That's not correct. What this is an oath of clearance. What he's basically saying is, someone needs to justify the punishment. Someone has to tell me what the charges are. And so he says, show up. Let me know what the charges are. So that's the idea. There's a oath of clearance here at the end of 31, and this is what motivates Elihu to get up. And I want to just say a little bit about Elihu. I know we're short on time, so let me go to Elihu. Here he is. These wonderful watercolors from William Blake from 1820s. I think still very helpful. I hope you've noticed some of the artwork and some of the poetry. That's quite intentional. I think poetry and art are very valuable in helping us capture things that can't be expressed in words. And so yeah, there's this wonderful book called In the Low. I've used several of the pictures. It's a brand new book by Scott Erickson. Some of you know Scott Erickson's work from Advent, the first drawings he did. And McRoberts James McRoberts is the one who writes the poetry. It's about prayers in the dark. It's called In the Low. And I highly recommend it. It's just an amazing resource, I think. Elihu might be the only Israelite around. We're not sure if he's an Israelite, but he might be the only Israelite around. His name means, He is my God. And he's young and angry. Notice with me, verse 6. I'm young in years, you're old, and that's why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But it's the Spirit in a man, the breath of the Almighty, that gives him understanding. It is not only the old who are wise, not only the aged who understand what is right. Therefore, I say, listen to me. And he's going to have a lot to say. But I want you to notice what he's saying is that one aspect of wisdom is revelation. He is leaning into the prophetic tradition. And it doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been sitting in the classroom. It doesn't matter how long you've been observing life in the school of hard knocks. God can speak. God can reveal himself. And this Elihu helps us anticipate that God is going to speak. What's really interesting here, though, is he serves as somewhat of a strange mediator for Job. He's still critiquing Job. He's still saying Job's in the wrong for saying that God is unjust. That's the main criticism, but he's also criticizing the friends, and he's saying they have not proved their case. And so I have to stand up and I have to defend God's character. That's always a questionable move, one that we should think carefully about. There's a lot of people ready to do that. There are times to speak, but sometimes we speak too quickly, right? So Elihu represents the prophetic tradition. And what's interesting is that the question that we might ask is to say, well, does God have to respond to Job? Does God have to, is he being summoned to court? Does he have to come and show up and explain himself to Job? Is that really how this is going to work? And the answer is no, that's not how it works. I mean, what we see when the Lord does speak is that he doesn't so much answer Job as he cross-examines Job. We'll get to that in just a moment as we close. But Elihu is a strange mediator. He kind of sets the way that, no, the Lord did not respond to Job because he was summoned to court. The Lord responded to Job just because. In other words, the Lord responded to Job for no good reason. There's that phrase again. In other words, the universe does not run as some sort of machine where it's this goes in and this comes out. That's not the way God manages the universe. God manages the universe in great, wild wonder that's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our explanation. In other words, God manages the universe primarily, not just out of justice, he is just, but he manages the universe also out of grace, out of gift, out of abundance. And so all of these, Job gets a trip to the zoo with God. He gets to go to the zoo with God. He gets to go as an astronaut, and he gets to look at all the universe. God gives him a tour, right? And what's so striking about that is, yes, it answers in many ways Job's curse upon the day of his birth. In many ways, it responds to that. But the answer is not correction. The answer is abundance, grace, more than you can explain, more than you can take in, more than you can describe. So Elihu does come as an arbiter of sorts, but he's not the kind of arbiter that Job needs. And yet in the story, he does help make it clear that God doesn't respond to the oath of clearance. That's not why he comes to Job. God comes to Job simply out of grace, simply because he decides to, simply because, well, for no good reason. So let's take a look just as we close here at the last part. He says, we're not going to deal with a happy ending. We're going to talk about that tonight when we deal with the problem of pain. It's a very important ending, and it's I think we should wrestle with the ending of restoration. There's, I think, some things to say about that, but we're not going to do that right now. I do want to just look briefly at what the Lord says. There's two parallel passages, 38 and 40. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand who marked off its dimensions. Surely you know who stretched a measuring line across it. And then he begins to talk about the seas and the doors that guard the seas and the morning stars and the dawn. And these are all things that counter Job's curse on the day of his birth. Notice the emphasis on light and life and abundance and majesty and wonder. And how expansive that is over against how small Job made himself. He wanted to make himself disappear in chapter 3, right? That's what grief does to us. So what we see at the end of the book of Job in the Lord's response is an emphasis on wonder. Job does not find an explanation to the problem of his suffering per se. Rather, he finds a wondrous, wise, powerfully good, and just Creator in the storm, who calls him back from his cursing to fierce, mature wisdom. Don't give up your complaint about injustice. That's just what a wise person would do. In wisdom, cosmic order and social order converge. The sages consider themselves keen observers of the world filtered through informed by their theological convictions. I saw, and I looked, and I perceived, I received instruction. But the sages not only are observers, they are also fearers. The fear of the Lord is the way of wisdom. Seeing and fearing coalesce in wonder. And so what we see is that awe, fear, there's a certain terror to it. It can create wounds. And it does create wounds. And at the same time, it fills the heavens and the seas with life. Life that cannot be explained in some sort of vending machine version of justice. Because here's the thing, and I'll close here. God is merciful to the unjust. God is gracious to his enemies. God is merciful and gracious for no good reason. Amen.
Greg, thank you so much. What we're going to do at this point is we have one more session in our time together this morning, but we want to exercise mercy on you. We want to lean into the way of wisdom and attend to our bodily needs and care for one another. So we have pizza and salad and cool drinks on the back table, but here's where it gets tricky. We're going to improv, as Dr. Perry has taught us. Your mama, like mine, said not to talk with your mouth full. We're going to invite you to talk with your mouth full, right? So grab some pizza, some salad, bring it back to where you are, and I'm going to get some chairs, and we're going to invite our panel to receive questions. If you're online, grab your sandwich, grab your cup of coffee, text me for questions. I've already got a dozen or so. So we're going to go back and forwards between your questions online, your questions here in the room. But let's take 5 minutes at most to grab your slice of pizza, grab your salad, and we'll be back here in 5 minutes to begin our Q and answer time. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. Please do feel free during this time, if you're in the room, do feel free to grab up and step up and grab more pizza. We want you to be comfortable. We want you to feel free. But for sake of time, I'm going to invite our 4 stellar speakers, our panelists, up front. So come on up, guys. Thank you so much for allowing us to ask our questions. So here's how this is going to work. If you're online, you can text me. I've got a bunch of questions. I'll do my best to be attentive. If you're in the room and you want to be anonymous, you can text me, but I'll also be running around with this handheld mic. So I will be coming to you if you want to just ask your question. I'm going to say this as gently as I can, and I'm going to invite you to receive this as graciously as you can. Be thinking about your question in advance, and what we really want are questions. Okay, did I say that gently enough? Can you receive that graciously enough? Because we know how that goes. Our time is short, relatively, and we want to get as many questions in, but it's a sincere invitation to ask your questions. If you wish a particular question to go to a particular panelist, do indicate that. Otherwise, I'll be randomly or not so randomly assigning questions. But here we go. I'm going to start with some of the questions we have on the phone so you all can begin to formulate as my phone shuts down. Here's our first question. This is to any who would like to receive it. How do we address the question we saw on one of the slides that said, what if God does not always protect the righteous? I wrestle with how to reconcile trusting God when he says he cares for and protects the righteous while seeing the righteous suffer. Who would like to go first?
Well, we sit in sackcloth and ashes with that. Who of us wants to think about that? That for those we love most in the world and for ourselves, that in this life, God might not protect us from particular sufferings. He may, he might not. And so we feel that. It's a difficult thing to grapple with and mature into. And we hear Jesus say that startling thing really in such an uncomfortable way, where he said to his followers, do not fear those who kill the body. That's a very difficult teaching. And then he said that as God himself who would suffer. And I'm talking like a child with mysteries. God allowed himself not to be protected in the fullness of his humanity, and invites us to, how Greg said, to keep. I think Greg said that, God in the frame. God keeps being brought, or maybe that was Vicki, but God keeps being brought into the frame and of the story. And as Greg said, there's justice doesn't end with death, physical death in this life, but there's more beyond, because Jesus goes on to say to entrust ourselves to the one in whom our body and soul is held.
Yeah.
And that's not an answer, but it's just a resonance with.
Yeah, and I think, Zack, I definitely echo that. You said it way better than I would. I think just to acknowledge, that pushes us into a very helpless kind of space. That we're not able to make God show up when we want him to. And that's just really hard.
Yeah. I think eschatology is helpful in that part of bearing witness to the reality of the kingdom of God in the New Testament is in the overlap of the age, our life is cruciform, that God uses suffering to bear witness to his justice and to even bring about change. I think of the ways in which our brothers and sisters in the early part of the civil rights movement, it really was a gospel action to love your enemies and to be bombed and threatened and, dogs coming against you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many different expressions of that evil. And yet through their willingness to stand their ground and bear witness in nonviolent resistance, they bore witness to the kingdom of God that is already here and is coming. And so for some reason, because of Jesus, I guess is the best way we could say it, our testimony, in part, in the overlap of the age, is through suffering.
So you're going to hear us now as we drop in and out of different topics, but there is an invitation to come back to things that we hear, okay? But one more question, I think, for Vicki or Greg. Where do you think the book of Job falls on the timeline of Scripture? When should we understand these events may have happened? Where do we fit Job?
You want to go first? You're an Old Testament person. I'm a New Testament person.
That's a good question. It's a hard question because the narrator and the poet they don't give us many clues.
Yeah.
So it's hard to die on any particular hill.
Yeah.
And say this is actually where it falls.
Yeah.
We can notice that the language of the story is Hebrew. So it's ancient Hebrew. It's being told in the time period and to the people who would be able to understand that.
Yeah.
And even to cast those characters who, to your point, Greg, are probably, most of them are not
Israelites.
like Israelite. They're not descended from Abraham.
Right.
Biologically, like we're not supposed to understand that. So, and yet they're here. We hear them in Hebrew. So, I've heard different things. People who speculate it's very ancient. Those events, the events and the writing are very ancient, and I don't have any more to say than that, other than we can't die on that hill.
I would agree with Vicki. I would highly recommend Francis Anderson's incredible commentary. He goes into this, but I think he makes a compelling case to me. The events that are told seem to be resonant with the patriarchal period. There's no tabernacle, and these people aren't Israelites, but Job is offering sacrifices for his children, right? So he's acting as a priest, which would not be allowed in the monarchical period or whatever. At the same time, it seems like that something is developing here in relation to the accumulation and perspectives of wisdom traditions. And it seems to me that Elihu may well be a later addition in the process of teaching wisdom students. That the prophetic tradition, you keep teaching, and time goes on. And so the fundamental story seems to be very ancient. And at the same time, you have this appearance of the prophetic tradition that seems to indicate that the conversation goes on. New questions are being asked. New traditions are emerging that impact the telling of the story. So it's an interesting. Elihu is a very mysterious figure. It's like, where does he come from? And then, so I would recommend Francis Anderson's commentary as really helpful in this regard.
One thought I had too, Job talks in 6:10 about, this would be my comfort, I would even exult in pain unsparing, for I had not denied the words of the Holy One. So maybe that's a clue that there were words that were recognized. So somewhere like, maybe this is after there would have been words written down, like after Moses, the Pentateuch, maybe, perhaps. And we can certainly say another internal event. We can look in this for references to other internal events within the text. It's after creation. We can say that.
That's really good.
We can, because the Lord says over and over again, were you there when? Right. And so any of the things that he says, were you there when, if we could put those on a timeline, for sure that's already happened. So
that's excellent.
I have a question. Greg, you said, I'm right here in front of you.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
And your name is?
I'm Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
So you talked about for no good reason a few times.
Yeah.
And at one point you said the Lord responded to Job for no good reason at the end. And earlier you spoke about this absurdity and randomness to evil. And so how is that connected, and what are we to expect? Is it because we live in a world that is for a time ruled by the Satan that we must come to terms with or reconcile or surrender to or submit to this randomness that the suffering occurs in, evil occurs in, and then God meets us?
I think if I understand your question, so there's no direct correlation in terms of part of the absurdity that I was talking about, is that justice is a very big concept. It's not a small concept. And I think part of what the book of Job is doing is expanding the frame to say this is not a mechanical God responding directly and simply to whatever actions you did. Righteous, you get a blessing. Unrighteous, you get a curse. But God is managing the world in a much bigger frame. Justice is real in the end, and sometimes immediately. But it's not the only category. It's not the only thing we should consider. And so what I was getting at with the no good reason is more about God's grace and the generative, creative power of God, who doesn't punish sin the way it deserves. And because he doesn't, there's mercy with him. At the same time, there is still justice in that it is addressed. We learn later in the New Testament, in the context of the Old Testament, it's the priestly tradition and the way that animals are acting as substitutes, right? It gives us a sense of how this happens in general terms. But let's not just address suffering and evil on the basis of justice. We must. Don't give up justice. Don't give up conventional wisdom. Don't reject it. But add a wider frame of mercy and grace. And this wild magnificence that God's creative power is so abundant. You know, all of these different animals that he delights in, and all these different stars that have seemingly very little relevance to us, but he just loves it. So that's the idea of the no good reason part, is that, you know, Satan is leveling the accusation. Does Job do this for no good reason, or is he on the take? Is he getting something out of it? And you flip it around, though, in terms of God is creating for no good reason, just because he wants to, just because it's an overflow of his love and of his life. And at the same time, also, there's the matter in reference to justice, that he's merciful to the unjust. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it's like the big picture is God. And then what's happening here is
God there's a relationship between the divine counsel and what's happening on the earth. Job makes that very clear. But it's not a simple relationship that we can easily explain. It's much bigger. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. Just as a clarification, when I hear you say no good reason, that's not you questioning the goodness of God or the goodness of his plan and purposes in the world. What you're reminding us is that there isn't a logical reason that we can break down and get to of our own volition or capacity. There's just more going on because of who God is.
Yeah, and it's not because Job is necessarily righteous that the Lord answers him.
Thank you, yeah. Lillian, this is a question for you with your counseling hat on. What does healing really look like after tremendous suffering? If we aren't rushing people through their grief, what does healthy healing look like?
That's a great question. I think the way that I think of it, and I think there can certainly be some variety in this answer. I don't know that there's a perfect way, but the way that I think about it, when we think of the stages that people move through, I think often there's a stage where it feels everything's just a mess and everything's upside down and nothing is right. And then I think for many people there is then a stage where they're at least open to wanting to see some good left in the world, even if maybe they feel guilty about that because things are such a mess. And then there's time when both can be true. Sometimes Zack will say like the bad things are the only thing that's true. You know, I think that with healing there comes a time that that's no longer the only thing that we can see, even if maybe it still brings us pain. Maybe we still walk with a limp or have scars, but there's we move to a place where we can also let some goodness in and have it be a part of our life instead of the whole thing.
Yeah. That's good. I do want to go back just to add one thing to the previous. Zack said something earlier to me that I thought was really insightful, that another reason why the Lord responds to Job is because he asks. And so part of what we should not depersonalize the expansion of the frame. In other words, even though the frame is much bigger than that which the friends and everybody's operating in and what they can manage, God can attend to the badgers and to the behemoth and be very aware of Job. And he can handle it. And so he's aware, and he hears Job ask for this audience. Not once, not twice, but just countless times. Just over and over and over again. Reminds me of the New Testament. Keep knocking, keep asking.
I'm Dustin Hayes. So this is in reference to something that you said, Dr. Perry, but open for anyone. You did a quick nod to Proverbs starting with wisdom is rooted in fear of God, and Ecclesiastes ending with that.
Yeah.
So I guess a twofold question is, what's a healthy and good conceptualization of fear in those terms? And then how does that frame our understanding of the conversations in Job? Just kind of more deeply.
I'll just start with initially what I said, which is the best way, I think, are the words awe and wonder. That fear has some sense of terror in it, and that in the way we use the word in English. And there can be terror in awe. And that's part of what I think William Brown was getting at really helpfully, is that wonder and awe can create wounds. The creative power of God is both constructive and destructive. It's awesome. It's unmanageable. And so the storm is a great example, right? Because the storm both waters the earth and it destroys things, right? It creates landslides. And so I think part of what it's getting at is that sense of awe and wonder, that both the magnificent power of God, but also that the sovereignty and manageability of what God can superintend in the end, that's far beyond ours. And so there's a basis for trust in his faithfulness to the earth and his faithfulness to all that he's made. He's not just powerful, which is part of what the Friends keep saying. God's powerful. How can you oppose him? You can't win. Job gets that. But there's more to it than that. He uses his power to create life and to sustain life and to care for the world. Anyway, that's the way I would begin. That's just the beginning.
Dustin, what a great question. And
Yeah.
thank you, Greg. That's helpful. So those of you who came to my session know that one of the things I talked about was that we expect the text to raise questions like this. I think this is a question that the text invites us to have. And then, therefore, we should look in the text to see what kind of answers it will provide, which doesn't mean that we have to always accept those answers, but at least go on that journey. And so I was thinking about in Job 28:8, where the fear of the Lord is used. And he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. And this comes at the end of that poem about where is wisdom. And so that would be a question to look at the poetry. We can look at the poetry and say, like, well, what does this mean in this context? Verse 20, from where then does wisdom come? Where is the place of understanding? That it is hidden from all the eyes of the living, concealed from the birds of the air. So we don't have access to it. But, verse 23, God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. He looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. And so what kind of fear does that invite? Like, what would we put in there? Like, I think awe, wonder is in there, but also a sense of, I think, probably of humility to say, I don't have any right to ask and demand God for wisdom. But I can hold out my hand in faith and trust that he will hear me. That's our hope in our prayer, right? So that's just I think there's so much in there in the end of 28 that could really help us unpack that question. But
Yeah.
On the pastoral side, I just always, I feel hesitant to reference C.S. Lewis because Vicki just took us to the text, and really that's where we need to be. But I do appreciate, I appreciate the scene in one of the, of course there's the is he safe? No, but he's good. But there's the scene where, I forget which of the young girls it is, but she's thirsty. And between her and where she can finally get something to drink is the lion. And she pauses, and he says, come and drink, And she says, but you're a lion. And he says, you're thirsty, come and drink. And she says, well, you promised not to hurt me. And Lewis has Aslan say, I can make no such promise. I've devoured princes and kings and kingdoms, but you're thirsty, And this thing you were just describing, I feel like it gives us good clues to the wonder and awe of this Aslan as this amazing creature, inviting us, and yet making no promise that he's not promising us that he'll be tame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to stick on that pastoral note for a moment. So Zack and Lillian, coming in your direction. This question comes to us from a pastor in Illinois. He asks, what do you do when a person's grief leads them to isolate more and more and put up boundaries, barriers to any helpful engagement? It can feel that my only option as a pastor is to pray. But is there ever a responsibility to assertively impose oneself into another's grief? Or must we respect the boundary and let them isolate?
I just don't know. It's both. That's such a caring question from a pastor's heart, who's even aware that a grieving person is isolating. Like, just that you even know that is a remarkable grace and love to that person, but also in your life. Not all of us pastors are aware like that. And the second thing I would say is it seems like we do plead and pray, and we remind each other that that is real action, that your prayer for the person who's breaking apart and isolating themselves, they're choosing folly as a way to deal with their pain, which we all understand. Proverbs 18, it's our folly that causes us to isolate ourselves. That is understandable, and our prayer is real action. As Greg was just reminding us a little while ago. And then the third thing is I'm thinking of community. What does it mean not to be an isolated pastor in this scenario? Like, in a strange way, when someone isolates themselves like that, on the pastoral team, we can think it's only us, and even if we don't have a team, we're a small, we're pastoring a smaller church or something. Are there helpers? Are there a community of resources? Are there others who realize the person is isolating, who love that person too? And together, even if it's one other person, that's a blessing. And we're now praying together, which is real action. We are respecting boundaries, and we're going to check in. So I can say, I hear you. I'm going to call back. I'm going to call back. And we can persist in that way that honors a boundary, but continues to remain present and invite presence. And then at that point, if someone's still isolating, I'm looking to, in our church, I'm looking to counselors that I'm looking for advice. And so there's the next thing I'd say is, because there is a time and place for intervention in which the community who loves the person comes over anyway. And discerning that time, I want to look for folks who have an expertise that I don't in that area. And then finally, I'd say, if you find yourself that you feel alone, that there aren't others who have that love and recognize the isolation, and you don't feel like you have access to counselors who could help sort of discern where we're at, then please give me a call. And we have a community here that can try to be of help. Yeah.
And as it turns out, we have a counselor sitting next to you. So maybe, Lillian, we'll ask you this question of boundaries and when we might cross them. Can you help us there?
Yeah, I think Zack actually gave a great answer, and I think I would have to say I don't know of necessarily a pattern or like a rule that could be applied to this situation, but I do think that to prayerfully be considering that a time might come when we might push a little harder. I really liked Zack's, the way that he described it, that sometimes we might just issue a gentle reminder that we're still around and that even if a lot of time has passed, they shouldn't feel like they couldn't reach out. Sometimes people, if they've been ignoring us a long time, they don't want to take that step. And so maybe that gentle reminder, like, hey, we're still here whenever you're ready. I like Zack's point about being in community. Sometimes when people are isolating, then we start to feel what's wrong with us. So being mindful of that. But I do think there can be a time when maybe we start to think that there's a safety concern, that there's a mental health concern, that there's a concern that this person is just in a place where they kind of cannot see their way forward. And so then we might think about, okay, how do we kind of move in? And I tend to think about things like, what's the most gentle thing that would work, right? So we don't maybe start at a 10, but if we're kind of inching closer, and it's not working, then maybe that's where we do say, okay, let's involve others. Let's try to be a little more direct.
Thank you both. I'm going to come to Vicki and to Greg, both of you, on this. When we speak of the fear of the Lord, what do we mean by fear? Biblically, tell us about that language, and specifically, how do we speak of that language in our contemporary context when living in fear can have such a negative connotation? So help us with that language there and also now.
Do you want to go first?
I'll let you go first this time.
Oh, goodness. Didn't I go first last time?
No.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
But, yeah.
I mean, this is a tough one, of course, right? I think it is helpful. It can be helpful to recognize that the words that, the language that the scriptures were originally written in were not our language and not our culture. And the word for fear in Hebrew, Greg can help in Greek, is a very wide range. It has a wide net. It's very rubbery, and so you have to look around and think about, it may not be when the biblical author says fear, it may not be what we would say, what we would mean when we say fear. So that's, I think, can you remind me of the second part of the question?
Yeah, given that the language of fear has such negative connotations in our contemporary context, how do we hear or transpose this language?
Yeah, that's it's to sit in that space, because I think we can shy away and just immediately say, like, okay, let's make it awe or reverence, something that feels more palatable to us. And yet I do think we have a commitment to try to cooperatively read with the text and discern what the author is trying to say. And even if we don't know the ancient languages, that's fine. Just look around the text and see what is being emphasized here. What kind of fear are we talking about? And then I think that's really important, because then that informs what we might say, what in our language, well, what would we call this thing that's been translated fear? Like, what would we, and act that as a bridge. Would not just assume that what we think is fear, and it has very powerful and valid cultural concerns about that word, that it may not be the same that's in the text.
I think that,
I don't know, that was helpful.
The cultural context of the scriptures, one of the challenges is this idea that the one who has the power, like complete power over life and death, is who we're talking about. And so the image of the divine council and the reign of a king, not just a king, but like the king, who's more powerful than all the other kings, is part of the context. And we talked a little bit about the divine council. So there's a certain, and the other word that fits in there is glory. And in Hebrew, the idea of glory is weightiness, heaviness. And all the hosts, the armies, and the attendants, and everything that speaks to how great this king is, lends this sense of weight. And we know from books like Esther and others that you don't just go into the king's throne room. You have to be invited upon pain of death, right? So that context is very alien to us. Post-Enlightenment, highly individualistic. We believe in the autonomous self. I mean, that's just a completely different frame of reference, right? So what Vicki said earlier when we were talking about this, about humility, I think it's really helpful. The other thing about a king, though, that we see in the Old Testament is not just the king's power, but words like father and shepherd are king words. There's a sense of the responsibility of a king to protect his people, to provide for them. And so it's not just a sense of terror of this person has power of life and death over me, but it's a sense of this is where I need to go to get what I need for life. And so it goes back to Zack's illustration about Aslan, about being thirsty. And what's interesting about wisdom in the poem in 28 is even though it says that only God knows the way, and so there's a sense of awe, majesty, this idea of even terror, is it never says don't pursue wisdom. In other words, we're thirsty. We keep going. We move forward, right? This is where we need to go to get what we need to live. And so that there's that humble submission that is also assertive and intentional and purposeful in pursuing the king. But realizing that we're not going to demand anything from the king. The king has the power to provide and to protect. And I don't know if that's helpful, but I think the royal imagery helps me explain it a little bit. I don't know.
From a pastoral perspective, the sense of, educating our people at church, how should you approach the book of Job? Should we see it as a beautiful masterpiece of Hebrew poetry that offers us hope and perhaps some answers in the midst of suffering, or does it give us a guide from which we can draw an outline to follow through life's unbearable seasons?
What was the very last sentence there?
If the book gives us an outline, if we can go through the book and have like these points, and while teaching our congregations, we can say, hey, follow this while you are in this time.
Yes. That's a great question. Pastorally, with our congregation, I know there are others in the room who are pastors who are also preaching through Job. I'm preaching through Job right now. And so there would be different good answers, but when I speak tonight, sort of the outworking of this is what I'll share in essence about. But Job helps us in a number of ways. It gives us, it considers evil evil.
Mm-hmm.
So evil's not an illusion from
Amen.
which we must detach. The second thing is it considers good good. And a lot of us we might say if evil exists, how could God exist? But most of us will say evil exists and we know good exists. And so good is good in the book of Job. I'll flesh that out more tonight. But cynicism is real. Church hurt is real. Religious folly, bold truth spoken foolishly is real. So these resources, what I'm saying, this book provides a congregation the grace, the capacity to enter a story in which evil is real and good is real, cynicism is real, church hurt is real, and come to terms with someone who doesn't take the cynic's path, even though he's church hurt. Job continues, as we've been hearing from Greg and Vicki, he never lets go of God. He actually moves all the more toward God, even though he's experienced a cynicism he's unaware of and a theological bully committee in the name of friendship. And that leads us to ask the question, why is it experientially that some people experience what we call the problem of evil and suffering, and rather than let go of God, they move all the more toward God? And in that, in these resources, the story provides for us, our hope begins to emerge. We're able to say, we're able to have a category as a congregation or a community to say, like a tree, I forget exactly how Job says it, but like a tree, the Lord has pulled out my hope. And then Job will say, though he slay me, I will hope in him. And the fullness of that experience, as a pastoral community, as a congregation of the Lord's people, we can grow in that capacity with these resources the story invites us into. And finally, there's a lot about this that Jesus takes up in his person and in his work, in his stories and in his teaching. And that all that together can shape the imagination and form us in wisdom as a pastoral community, little by little, day by day, week by week, year by year.
This is a question for Greg, but I'm going to tag you in as well, Lillian. So here's the text. Greg, thank you for the opening message this morning, but here's my cry, here's my scream. Those who suffer due to mental illness. How do we walk alongside people with mental illness? And then we find ourselves unable to do so because their response is to cut us off. And so we sit without context. So Greg and Lillian, how do we help people whose suffering is longer term and ongoing, and there's perhaps cognitive factors that prevent this kind of dialogue that we might enjoy in other ways?
You want to start, or you want?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think I would like to start by saying that's just really painful and hard.
Yeah.
There's just not a way around that. And it's a way that brokenness just touches all of us. It's painful for the person with mental illness. It's painful for the people who love them. I think that what we've said before about that prayer is a real thing, I think is important. I think that we can, over time, hopefully use some of our attunement skills to figure out, sometimes when there's mental illness, understanding how the person's taking in the world, it can be tricky, and then it's tricky for us to communicate in a way that's going to land well for the way they're taking in the world, and they can't always be figured out, but I think sometimes maybe with some openness and some prayer we can get clues that make it a little better. And then the sad reality is sometimes people do cut us off when they have mental illness, and that's really hard. And that's where maybe we pray, maybe there are other resources that we hope can be sent toward that person, or maybe we know someone we think they might connect with, because I know it gets hard too, because we think of safety and care for the person, and then if we're cut off. And then I guess I would say there's always kind of that line where, kind of like we talked about with the person who's isolated, is there a time where for their safety we do have to intervene in a way that likely makes them really upset with us, but we think will help them? That can happen sometimes when there need to be hospitalizations or different things like that. And then that's hard, and we kind of have to just... Yeah, it's just really hard. I've walked with family members through that, and sometimes you have to deal with the fallout, but you're just trying as best you can to love that person and act in accordance with their safety.
Yeah. Darlene and I have friends who have a son who's now 28 years old, who had a brain infection when he was born. Born healthy, well, actually not when he was born, but around age 6, had this infection, and now he's has to have 24-hour care. So whether it's mental illness or chronic physical issues, in terms of the long-term care, I think there's got to be a bigger community of. And even beyond the church, we're part of a wider humanity. So in his case, he kind of aged out after school certain programs and resources, but now he's able to go for day visits or whatever, and they have people come into the home, for example. But I think the thing that I respect so much about the way that James and Bev have loved their son, and the way is that they are part of a church community, and he comes to worship and in his wheelchair, and there are ways in which he communicates through postcards, and so what's, I think, critical here is not just what's going on with their son, but how that's impacting the community in terms of their own growth, and so it's not just about the care receiver. And one of the things that, whether it's mental health or chronic physical issues, is how can we avoid warehousing people? There are times when safety is of the essence, and where there needs to be maybe temporary interventions or whatever, but just leaving people in an institutionalized space where there's no real relationship, that's a violation of fellowship. And so how do we continue to go on in manageable ways? I think it's going to take a lot of people, even beyond the church, and the common grace and the general revelation that God gives us through medicine, through other things, will be important. But it's an opportunity to bear witness to God's grace and love, and not just what we give to the care receiver, but I mean how they minister to us as well, and what we receive. So I think we go in with a lot of assumptions about a sort of a one-way street when it's multi-directional. And anyway, those are some of the...
Can I add one thing that I wish I'd said, and your
Please.
point made me think of it? I think, too, it can be helpful when we just kind of make space for things. Like, I know sometimes when people struggle with depression, they may kind of vanish for a few weeks, but then they come back. And so to sometimes have some understanding and space for some of those things, I think can be really helpful in community also. Or if, that's just the example. I think there could be other things, too. But just having some space that, like, people have struggles, and it may mean that sometimes they behave in certain ways, and we can roll with that.
Thank you both. Got two more questions and then we'll wrap things up unless there's something burning here in the room. But for Vicki and Greg, this question pertains to a feature of the text and the book of Job. Did God's rebuking of Job's friends extend to Elihu? Do we know God's disposition towards Elihu defending God while also rebuking Job?
Can you say the first, sorry, I heard
Yeah.
the mower.
I understand. Did God's rebuking of Job's friends extend to Elihu? There's the mower.
Right.
Do we know God's disposition towards Elihu?
I mean, this is a great question. And I haven't figured it out, but I wonder.
Yeah.
Because he just pops in and then he disappears. And we don't hear anything more about him.
That's right.
And he speaks, if you listen to Job, it's an hour and 40 minutes in English. Hebrew would be shorter. I don't know, maybe hour and a half or hour 15. Elihu speaks for 15 minutes, more than God. He speaks for 10 minutes. So it is a big deal. And I think this is a question that the text intends us to wrestle with. So I don't have a good answer, but I think it's a cooperative question. And then probably people are tired of me saying this. I would say, like, what clues does the text, if the text is going to raise a question, shaping the people of God in a certain way, we can ask legitimately, how does it help us answer that question? And I I want to hear what you have to say, Greg. What clues does the...
I don't think that we know. I think that it's clear that the Lord doesn't say anything about Elihu. And so, yes, the text invites the question. The prophetic tradition is like the various expressions of the conventional wisdom tradition in that it's limited. And at the same time, because it's a human, at the same time, it points us to something that is borne out in the storm and in what the Lord says. And that is that revelation is necessary and revelation is real. And so I don't think there's a direct affirmation of Elihu, but I think that we get these clues in what he says that in some ways make space or prepare a way for the Lord speaking. But the Lord doesn't feel compelled to defend himself against Elihu or to correct Elihu. He basically ignores him. And it's perplexing. But
Can I just say, sorry. I thought of, okay, so here's some clues. 32, 1-5. He gets 5 verses of prose, kind of in the middle.
Right.
And he's known for 2 things. He's angry and he's young. And the text emphasizes that over and over again. Not only is the narrator, but Elihu himself is fine just saying, I'm young and I'm angry.
Yeah.
So I think in the ancient Near East, in the wisdom sphere, to be young is not necessarily a recommendation, right? So I think we're probably inclined to kind of be like, maybe you should just keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
And the anger is odd too, because we're like, how is that? But then God talks about being angry later, right? He's angry with Job's friends at the very end. So that's odd too. So again, those are 2 things. And I think the key is the poetry. The author is going to make us get into the poetry and stick into, like, what is Elihu saying? Are we supposed to agree with this or not? Like, is he speaking honorably of God?
I think one of the things I want to say about the different dialogues and the monologues is we want good guys and bad guys. That's what we want. It's not what we get. We don't have white hats and black hats. We have tweed hats. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. Satan's bad. He's a black hat. Yeah. That's true. That's true. Thank you. So part of wisdom is what should we affirm? You know, what should we take from this? We need help. And it comes sometimes from strange quarters. But we have the algorithms now that have everybody opposed to one another. You got good guys and bad guys. And what's interesting, I think, about this is instead of black and white, we have a palette of different expressions, different shades, and it's on us to do some sorting, to get into the poetry. Yeah.
We are given tremendous readerly agency.
Agency. That's the word.
We are not.
Thank you.
They do not chew this up for us. We're not being spoon-fed. We have to do the work.
That's right.
Does the one part of the question, and I'm going to preach on this in a couple weeks, so I'm getting free advice here. The question of Elihu's rebuke of Job, is it seems like that is answered. Is that correct? That in God's defending Job to the three friends, that would cover?
For sure.
Because God defends Job, he has said what is right of me.
He does seem like an accuser, Elijah.
Yes.
He does turn out to be an accuser.
On that score, that would include, God is saying Job has said what is right of me.
Yes.
And so that would include what Elihu had
Criticizes.
had criticized. Is that
Yeah.
right? That's what I'm thinking.
I think
That's what
so.
I'm planning to say, but I just want to make sure I'm on the right track.
I think you're on good ground.
Okay.
But the emphasis of there's agreement between the friends, Elihu and Job, on God's power.
Yes. That's good.
Everyone agrees on that.
Okay.
And that's what is emphasized.
And his kingship.
But the big dispute has to do with justice and whether or not God is being unjust. And the perspective of the readers shows that it's the accuser, it's the challenger, and the cynic, who is addressing this whole issue of this for that, of righteousness for blessing, right? And so when Job speaks about that, in terms of his own sense of himself, that he is not in a pattern of sin or experiencing these things because it's a curse, covenant sanctions against him, he's speaking right. And we know that to be true. Whereas Elihu and the others want to say, that can't be right. And so the Lord sets the record straight. Yeah.
I want to thank each of you for helping us with our questions, of which I'm sure there are many more. And that reminds us, for those who are able and willing, you can come back this evening. We'll have 2 more presentations, one from Zack, one from Greg, a little more zeroed in on the question that's behind so many questions. What about suffering and the problem of pain? But for now, can I invite you just to express thanks for our 4 speakers, our 4 panelists. So I'm thankful for each of you online and present who've given up time to be with us this morning. Thank you so much. We trust this has been helpful. We are recording these sessions, so for the workshop you didn't get to, you'll still have the opportunity to hear Vicki or Lillian. You would help us if you take a slice of pizza and another book, if you'll make use of that. But thank you all for joining us today. Blessings on the rest of your day, and I hope that we'll see some of you this evening.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you all. Looking forward to hearing.